Hi, I'm Eric Rice, and welcome to the weekly social justice research seminar. And this week, I have, as I just said, I've got the pleasure of introducing myself. So we are going to be looking at, or I am going to be talking with you today about some work that I've been doing for the past couple of years looking into suicide prevention issues in the Army. So give me a second to fumble around with my computer and I will get us going. Okay. Okay. So using AI to understand suicidal disclosure in the Army, I have a army of collaborators in this particular project, and they're here up on the slide. But those of you who know folks who are researchers that are both current and former students, as well as other faculty members, it takes a lot of folks to do a project like this. So the place I'm going to start today is talking about networks, right? This is a lot of this research is going to be about using AI to understand what's happening in social networks. So networks are messy, powerful things, right? This particular picture is a social network, actually, of youth experiencing homelessness in LA. Can you see my little cursor as I jump? Oh yeah, I can. Great, I can point her with this. So in this, the boxes are people, the lines are the connections between those people, and the colors represent subgroups of these young people where the connections are denser within those subgroups than without. And you might ask yourself, well, what does this have to do with suicidal ideation and especially in the context of the Army and military affairs? So I want to share with you a story that shared with me last week. So I have a former DSW student named Tina Atherall, who is the executive director of Psych Armor, which is a not-for-profit who works with veterans and military affected people and their families. And my center, USC Case, has an academic partnership with Psych Armor. And I was in a meeting with Tina last week, and she told me the following story. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, especially when you're talking about how complicated networks get. So here's what this crazy story is. Okay, so what she told me, so she gets to this meeting and she says, oh, Eric, you know how we've been talking about suicide prevention and networks and how to leverage interventions in this space? I've got a great moment of this happening in my life in the last week. And she told me the following story. So the folks who are here, there's a group of girls who play in high school played lacrosse together. I couldn't find a lacrosse icon, so it's soccer players. They had a group of dads. These dads became friends in the context of having these lacrosse playing daughters and have maintained their friendship now that these women are now all in college. These dads are still hanging out and talking to each other and they get together regularly. So 2 weeks ago, this group of lacrosse dads gets together. One of them is a former Navy SEAL. While they're having beers together, this group of dads, the former Navy SEAL gets a call from one of his buddies, this guy who's an active duty part of the Navy, who is in crisis. And the dad is having what is actually a suicidal crisis at this moment. And he is sharing with his friend on the phone in real time the crisis that he's going through. This guy gets off the phone, he's really distressed. He starts to share with the rest of the guys in this over beers what's happening. This guy says, hey, my daughter's boyfriend's mom, AKA Tina, works in this space, has a not-for-profit that does work like this. Let me connect with him to connect with her, to connect to your guy and get him services. And within 48 hours, he was having conversations with folks about lethal means. He's gotten connected to the services outside of the VA that he wanted to get connected to that are serving veterans. And the suicide prevention network has done its work. So I tell you this story because this naturally occurring intervention is the kind of thing that I want to try to build and that I've been using AI to try to understand how this stuff happens. So, give you a little bit more of the academic context. So suicide is the #1 leading cause of death for people who are active duty in the Army. I am relatively new to working in the last few years in this space, and I rely very heavily on folks like Carl Castro to be my anchor in this. But I've been very interested in networks and suicide for quite a long time, both for my personal life as well as my interest in high risk young adults who are experiencing homelessness. But I pivoted over a few years ago into also looking at what's happening in the Army. And this has been an increasing epidemic within the Army, death by suicide in all armed forces. And one thing to understand here is that when people die by suicide, very few of them actually disclose their suicidal thoughts to anyone in their social network. So like this great moment of the story that I just told you about doesn't happen for 2/3 of people, okay? Only happens for about 1/3 of people. So my thought process is the following: how do we make things like the story I just told you happen more frequently? How do we understand what's going on in these networks so that we can try to leverage more of this? What I want to do is I want to use AI and social networks in order to do this research, because that's the kind of research that nerdy Eric likes to do. So I think one thing that I've thought about recently when giving these talks is, especially when I know that there's going to be a fair number of PhD students and some of my colleagues who are faculty that don't do work with AI, is just what the hell is this AI stuff anyway, right? Because I think we're thinking about AI as ChatGPT these days, and AI is definitely more than ChatGPT. In fact, a lot of AI is really in this space of machine learning. And to be fair, ChatGPT is also a form of machine learning. It's just an application of machine learning to large language models. And I'm not going to talk about this in this meeting, but if you want to talk about what that means afterwards, we can talk about what that means afterwards. But one of the things that AI and machine learning does, and does very well, is it makes predictions. Okay, so how does that happen? What does this mean? So the first thing you have to understand is machine learning is statistics, sort of. Okay, and when I say sort of, what I mean is in the math of it, it's often exactly the same, but how people approach it is different. So some of you haven't taken this class yet that are in this room, but I know I saw some folks online who probably remember in their doctoral programs learning about stepwise regression, forward step and backward step regression, and then you were taught it, and you were told it was data mining, and you were told to never do it because that's professional social scientists don't do that. That's literally what machine learning is. I mean, and it's been around for a very long time. The big advents in the last decade or so have been how much data can be processed, because the processing power has gone. It's not that the math has changed that radically. It's that the computing power and the ability to process not just thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions and billions of data points has started to come into play. But there's also a perspective on why are you doing this that's different, right? So in statistics, generally, we're interested in understanding the relationship between one or more variables. And is this thing associated? And usually we're asking that question because we care about hypothesis testing. I hypothesize that people who experience childhood sexual trauma are more likely to engage in unprotected sexual behaviors in their adolescence. And you want to look at a sample to see if, in fact, that's being borne out in the data, and if, in fact, that is not due to chance, right? That is not an artifact of bad samplers. In machine learning, the focus is just a little different. The focus is more on making predictions. So in machine learning, you're a little bit less interested in, is there an association in general between people who had a childhood sexual experience and whether or not in general you're likely to have a childhood sexual abuse experience and you're likely to have then risk-taking behaviors as an adolescent. It's more thinking about, as we enter in a particular person into this model and we know that they've had a childhood sexual experience and a few other things, would our model predict that that person is one of the people who we would expect would have a risky sex behavior as an adolescent? But the math that gets us there is exactly the same. It's just a different use of it. And I think for me, about 8 years ago, when this was explained to me that actually machine learning is statistics, my mind was like, oh, I thought it was magic. And then it was like, oh no, it's just regression, literally. And I was like, well, that's kind of boring and underwhelming. They're like, yeah, but with lots of computing power, we're really accurate. And I was like, okay. So it's with lots of computing power, it's really accurate. So, we're also, so to sort of reiterate these points just briefly again, standard statistical methods, you're trying to understand, is there a correlation, right? So these are some correlation scatter plots. In machine learning, you're primarily interested in how accurately are you assessing how a particular person plays out in that correlation. And people often talk about the true positive rate and the false positive rate and the area under the receiving operating curve, if you've heard any of these phrases. This is all trying to say this is an accurate guess given the data mining that we've done. Okay, so in practice, there's one more thing that's worth thinking about, especially if you're a doc student. And then I'm going to get into the actual study that we did and what we found and why I think it's exciting in the direction for new interventions like the story I was telling. Is that usually when we're doing statistics, what we do is we use the entire sample as our data set, and we test whether or not you've got these statistically significant associations, which is all geared towards hypothesis testing. In the machine learning approach, when we've got cross-sectional data, what we do is we train our model, we do the statistics, so to speak, with 80% of the data randomly selected, and then we hold aside 20% of the data, and we test the accuracy of how the model is assigning people to the yes or no categories that we might want to be looking at. And this is how we actually get the accuracy of a prediction. You build this regression model, and then you see how it treats a particular individual data point in the new 20% that's held over. But the model is exactly the same. And actually, in fact, logistic regression is one of the most commonly used machine learning things as a basic approach. And it's also one of the primary things we do in especially kind of behavioral health research, where we're trying to figure out this person had a suicidal ideation or not, this person disclosed their suicidal thinking or not. Okay. In this particular task, I'm actually going to use a slightly more complicated than just logistic regression. I'm going to use, but it's also a relatively older technology. It's called CART, sometimes called decision trees. This has become a very popular form of machine learning because it does two things that regressions in our standard regression model don't do that are kind of cool for us to start to think about as intervention designers. One is not only what is statistically significant and what's not statistically significant, but what's the most important independent variables. So when we're asking the question, to whom do people disclose their suicidal thoughts? It's not just here's the 4 or 5 things that are statistically significant, but this is the number 1 reason why people disclose, the number 2 reason why people disclose. And the thing that I like about this the best is that it handles interaction effects in a way that our standard statistical models, like linear regression models, don't do as well, because there you have to fit every single possible combination, whereas here you can data mine for the ones that actually matter. So you can actually get this, what you can think of as a decision tree logic. Like if this happens, then you go this way or this way. If you are a yes on this, what happens on the next variable if you're yes or no? What happens if you're on the next? And I'll give this in context in just a second. But it's a very powerful way of thinking about not just this thing, and this thing are all important, but how do they combine to be important, which is a really, I think for interventions can be really cool. All right, so this study, thank Thank God for Carl Castro is what I have to say about this, right? When you decide to do work with active duty Army, you had better have retired Colonel Castro in your back pocket, or driving, in this case, actually driving the car as you go on base, because he shows his ID, they wave you in with a smile and say, yes, sir. And it's like, it's a totally different experience than you would have if like hippie Eric shows up and he's like, hey, can I come in and interview people? I mean, they let me come with him. But it's yeah, it's a thing. And so we interviewed 241 active duty US Army personnel just before they were about to deploy. This was just before the pandemic. And we talked with them about their social networks, and we have information about 2,000 social network ties. And so we're going to do this data mining about the 2,000 connections that are their social networks. And we're going to ask the question, to whom are you likely to disclose your suicidal thinking? And what are the characteristics of those relationships that can describe those things? And can we learn something new about how we should think about intervention to resolve this? When we do data mining, one way that you can do data mining is you can literally throw the entire data set at things. That can be a bit problematic. You can end up having important variables like skip patterns, like I said, no, I don't want to answer this question. And then that becomes an important predictor of the process. That's not actually what you want. So we like to think of this as theory-driven data mining. So what my team does is, based on theory and prior literature of suicide risk and social networks, we identified about 40 different variables that we thought we were candidate variables to put into this machine learning. So it's a slightly curated form of machine learning, which I think starts to satisfy the knee-jerk reaction that I think people sometimes have to data mining in social sciences, which is that you're not employing theory and grounded ideas about the real world. You're just kind of seeing what sticks. And this is a kind of a halfway point. Like, we're seeing what sticks amongst the things that are reasonable to see what might stick. And so we've got a whole bunch of individual level variables like mental health, so depression. We've got issues around race, gender, disability, post-traumatic stress. We've got, what is your rank in the military, your sense of unit cohesion, how frequently you've been deployed. And then we've got a bunch of network level variables. So what is the nature of this relationship? Is it a romantic one, a familial one? What's the gender, the rank, et cetera, of the people? What kind of social support is provided by different people in these networks? And then we're just trying to see, of all of this stuff, what's important. Here's a technical slide that I'll skip. If you want me to talk about it later, I can talk about it more, but it's mostly just talking about the fact that these are nested data, and there's networks. Network ties are nested within the people that are the observers of those network ties that are telling you about them, and you need to deal with the fact that this is hierarchical data. Okay, so we did this machine learning. So we did the 80-20 split. We do this thing called k-fold cross-validation, which means that we don't want to rely on just this one random selection of 80% versus 20%. Maybe we got unlucky. So you do it 5 times and you aggregate across them, and you make sure that you're not actually biased by one poll, but it's actually generalized across all the polls. And then what you get out of this is that we get, first of all, what the machine learning folks love is how accurate is this, right? Very accurate, it turns out. So for social science data, this is actually awesome. Like, we have a 0.93 AUC, which is the area under the receiver operating curve. Basically, we're looking at the false positives versus the false negatives, and the true positives versus the true negatives, and the ratio of those things. If you have a score that's above 0.8, it's very good. That means basically 80% of the explanation is there. Well, above 0.9, it's excellent. This is a 0.93, which, given how complicated social life is, I was kind of blown away. But what you're going to see is that what predicts who you're going to disclose to is kind of painfully intuitive, but also really important. So, so here's the decision tree, and it's kind of hard to read here, but what I'm going to do, and certainly I can share these slides with anyone who wants them, but I'm going to zoom in to the part of this that really is where the pay dirt is, and that's here. So at the top of the tree, the 2 most important factors in this process are how much emotional support do you perceive from that connection, and how much informational support do you perceive from that connection. And what you see here in this first example is, if you receive emotional support, you have a 53% chance of disclosing your suicidal thoughts to that person, which is okay. If you did not receive emotional support, but you do receive informational support, so that's this decision tree logic, the if then, you have about a 39% chance of disclosing that thought, the suicidal thought to that network tie. But this one is when you have yes to the emotional support and yes to the informational support, then it goes up to 86%. So the delta is really big, right? Like you've gone from less than or about half to almost everybody, right? So this, and what I would argue is that probably in the moment of the story that I was telling at the beginning of the talk, it was a green box type of relationship, right? Like this is somebody who was calling the person, the buddy who's having beers with the lacrosse dads, right? And was telling them genuinely, this is all the things that are going on with me. This is where I'm at. And I know that you are somebody who can provide me with help and information. And in fact, it was the right call to be making because he actually was able to then link him up to, well, that dad was able to link him up to another dad who knew his daughter's boyfriend, whose mom was Tina, right? So so it's this pathway, right? And so what we think about when we were talking about this, and this is a Carl phrase, the actionable insight, right? That there's two things that are cool about this. One is that the difference between 39% or 53% disclosure and 86% disclosure is big. So that seems like it's worth attacking. The other thing is that it's something that we might really be able to design interventions around, right? I mean, you're not saying help design an intervention that makes people social support out of nowhere. You're saying take people who have some kind of social support and make it more social support. And it turns out that about close to 30% of the ties that people identified in these networks were those you had one kind of support but not the other. So instead of there just being like, you know, that 1 in 3 people that you might disclose, well, there's an interesting coincidental statistic. About a third of people disclose their suicidal thinking prior to their death by suicide from the death reports data that have been done with people who are active duty in the military. In our data set, we also saw that there was about a third of people who were identified as both emotional and informational support that I would likely give this kind of disclosure to. Whether or not those exact people would do that or not, I don't know, but it's kind of an interesting coincidence that this is sort of about a third of ties in both cases, or a third of people having, you know, this experience. So I feel like there's some, you know, maybe it's just neurological magic, but whatever. There might be magic, unlike the AI. There's no magic in the AI. Here, however, I think that the point that I'm trying to make is, and I'll stop here because I'm just about out of time, is that there's a pretty decent chunk of ties that are this type that we want to design interventions around. So where does this lead me? Basically, this leads me then back to Tina Atherall, who's my community partner in this space. And she and I have been actively talking for the past several months about how do we create for veteran and or active duty personnel these network level interventions that leverage this kind of insight about building support. And one of the things that I really like about this sort of perspective is that the onus isn't on the person who is experiencing distress, right? It's not saying call this hotline. It's the onuses of this intervention would be on trying to build up the support that surrounds these people so that when people are having crisis, those people are, you know, there to be there for people. And so hopefully we'll have more of these conversations like, you know, the guy who called his buddy while he was having beers with the lacrosse moms. So thank you to the Army for supporting the grant. And this is my last because I can't help myself with this one. I made this with ChatGPT. AI wants you. So there's so much stuff that you can do with AI. I spent 30 seconds making this with AI. And I think that we're in a place now when we don't have to necessarily be any more thinking about being computer scientists to do this stuff. We can work with computer scientists. We can use the tools that exist. So with that, I will stop and take questions. Thanks, folks. Okay, any questions? Oh, thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, I see an online. Go ahead, Rachel, unmute yourself. We should be able to hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
You can.
Okay, great. So I just have a simple question to start off. Is the application for this AI to connect people to other human beings, or is it to provide services that would be AI based?
So, I mean, I think that you could probably go either way. My intention, however, is to use AI to understand better what's happening in the conversation networks that already exist of folks, and then design interventions that are much more about face-to-face interventions. So it's not, in fact, this is using an AI tool to then create a very face-to-face personal kind of intervention, which is something that I've done a couple of other times as well too, around in some of the work that I've done with youth experiencing homelessness, where we've used AI to help design better interventions around violence prevention and sex risk prevention. I think that, thinking about, I don't want to replace social workers and human interactions. I want to use tools that make our work more effective, I think, is my general approach to this work. But I think you could also, Rachel, think about, is there I don't know, some sort of chatbot that could provide people information that they needed. But I think when people are in crisis, a bot's not going to do the job. It's about having, this is about bots. There's no bots in this study. This is about using AI and machine learning to understand how people are communicating with one another across these complicated networks. And then thinking about, how do we then make a new intervention out of this that's a face-to-face thing? Which maybe is underwhelming, because people oftentimes want to see me then think, we got a real-time data AI chatbot intervention, which is, and I'm usually kind of going the other way. I'm like, I'm going to use a bunch of fancy math to then do a very human intervention. But there's lots of approaches that you can take to this work. You could go the other way if you wanted to.
Okay, thank you.
Michal, I see you got a question. Oh yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah, hi Eric. Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and in a way, a continuation of a conversation we couldn't complete at the last conference. So it was very enlightening. Aside from the way you use AI and networking, which was very informative and interesting, specifically related to suicide in the military, I remember coming across a study that indicated that limiting access to firearms reduces military suicides. It sounds counterintuitive because soldiers need to carry arms, but they do all kinds of other jobs in the military. And typically, the study noted, it wasn't an American study, it was in the EU, that the suicides in the military happen by firearms much more than among civilians, because they have access to that, and that it happens mostly in off hours where they don't necessarily need the firearms. So just reducing access gave people an opportunity to reach out to the networks and get the support they need. Otherwise, even the best network will not be able to support them if they've committed suicide already. So I wonder what you think about that.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. And I would say one thought I have had is thinking about, this is a John Blaznick comment, that basically what we've been doing around suicide prevention hasn't really been working. And that we need to really rethink where and how we're doing that. And I think these structural interventions about limiting people's access to firearms are a really interesting one, because I think that is, if you remove lethal means and easy lethal means, which firearms certainly are, you place one more, in very real terms, physical barrier between people and their attempt for death by suicide. The other thing that I often think about, and this is kind of, I've been thinking a little bit about, I'm interested in suicide prevention. John Blazich is interested in suicide prevention, or Carl Castro is interested in suicide prevention. And kind of all of us are thinking about, okay, what we're doing right now isn't working, so let's try something new, let's try something different. But we all have very different ideas about what that thing should be, right? And I think that, my idea is, let's do funky AI data mining and see if there's new angles that we can get on these things. Carl's like, the paradigm is wrong. We should be thinking about moral injury, not about trauma. John's like, we got to go to places that we think are not the usual places. Like, let's go to, storage units and family law as opposed to mental health clinics. And what you're suggesting here too is like, and I've heard of this as well before, the structural intervention, that we can just limit folks' access to lethal means, it's going to really improve our chances of people just having more time to have that moment of reaching out. So I know probably the answer is, as with most complicated problems, that we need to do all of these things. It's not that any one of these things is going to be a silver bullet. I mean, if this were an easy problem, we would have solved it, right? And it's not. So, but thanks, Mahal. That was a great question.
Thank you.
So I'll take Ruth in the room, and then I think I see you.
I'm thinking about your next step there, and I'm not sure I heard a definition of what like an informational support is versus emotional.
Oh.
But I was wondering then, I'm assuming that we're not creating new people with these skills, but we're thinking who's already in your network and how can we provide those skills? So then the next question application is, what do those skills look like and how do we train or develop those in people?
This is my thoughts exactly too, which is why I've been talking to Tina. I've been saying because I am, some of you know, but maybe not all of you know, I'm not a clinician. I am a community-based researcher, and I do a lot of work where I'm very embedded in communities and spend a lot of time with people that are experiencing a lot of stuff, but I'm not a clinician, right? So my thoughts about this are, I need to find some folks who are clinicians who think about how to design clinical interventions, because yes, you're exactly right. The insight is not creating new friendships, but augmenting the support and engagement that those existing friendships have with people that are in potentially high-risk groups that are high risk for suicide. And emotional support is the sort of thing like, is this, when you talk to this person, do you go to them for, when you are feeling bad and you need to be lifted up, these sorts of questions. And then information support is usually, do you go to this person for help and advice when you're trying to solve a problem, right? So it's like a more instrumentally focused conversation versus a more, this is the person whose shoulder I cry on conversation. But then you have to think about, how do you build an intervention where you take somebody who might be comfortable having conversations about, you should do this, or I do this, and make them more the shoulder you can cry on. Or if you're the person that's the shoulder you can cry on, how do you make them more the person who also is willing to not just give you a hug, but also help you figure out how to do things. And not everybody in everybody's network serves both those roles. In fact, we oftentimes have some people that do both those things, but we often also bifurcate our networks. Like, I turn to Mike about stuff around, work stuff, but I don't usually cry on Mike's shoulder about stuff. I mean, so then it's like, okay, well, how do you then identify those people and then build them up? So, and that is clinical intervention that, therapists have to work on how to do this stuff.
But then the idea is then that you have one person that has both of those qualities, right, versus they have a larger network with more people with more variety.
Well, that's an interesting thought too. I mean, the main insight from this particular thing is that if you really want to understand who a person is comfortable disclosing suicidal thoughts to, there has to be multiple reinforcing forms of support. That it needs, like, it's such a deep wound that you're suffering from, and usually the root causes of these things are very personal, and there's so much stigma around suicide and suicidal thinking that just one of those just some support from any old random person isn't enough to get you to have this really personal conversation. So it's more about how do you create more stronger relationships, not more relationships. It's about enhancing the ones that people already have, probably. Which I think also makes our life a little bit easier, because I think when you're somebody who's suffering from the sorts of conditions that people who are experiencing suicidal ideation have, it often drives you into isolation, right? Asking those folks to make more friends is again putting the burden on the participant, as opposed to, here's some folks who you've already, you're depressed, which is certainly there's a lot of people who are depressed that do not suffer from suicide. There's a lot of people that die from suicide that aren't depressed. So there's a disconnect there, but it is a big risk category, right? Those folks tend to isolate already, right? So it's, saying, let's build an intervention where you make more friends seems tough to me, but taking the few people that you might say, well, I'm kind of limited, but this person's okay and this person's okay, and then going into getting those people and working with those people, as opposed, that's, I think, what I'm thinking about with this. I mean, so when I mentioned this to Tina, I mean, what she was really excited about was maybe this is more about it's not so much about working with the veteran or the person who's in the service, but it's about working with the family and friends that surround those people. And so it's more of these sort of outside the VA kind of community organizations that you would be thinking about in the implementation of something like this.
Military adjacent.
Yeah, these military adjacent, right? It's the and I'm, like I said, I spent most of my career working with youth experiencing homelessness in those community organizations, and so I'm really, I'm very reliant on having some community partners that have thought very deeply about this space and sort of, and it's really cool because you share these sorts of slides with those people, and they're like, oh, we could do this, which is a really cool thing, because I've been sitting here with these slides for about 8 months before I started sharing them with Tina, and I was like, we should do something. We should design an intervention, but it's like I didn't really have a lot of sense of what that would look like. So I got a couple of other online ones, but I'll take this.
It's just a comment. When we were in DC, wasn't the main comment from people from the VA and DoD too around firearms as well?
Yes. So this access to firearms
I just wanted to reiterate what Mahal was asking.
So the people in the DoD and people at the VA that I've talked to, it's, this comment that Mahal made about lethal access is a big deal. I mean, this is also why you have more successful attempts, first-time successful attempts of suicide by men than women, is because there's a gender difference in firearm access, and firearms is people don't survive those attempts very well, and that's also part of why it's so lethal with this group, is because this group, it's there is access to firearms, and access to firearms is very normative in this, even once you leave the services, because you've become well trained in using firearms and gun safety and all these other sorts of things, and you have a firearm that and then you start to have suicidal ideation, you have lethal means at your easily at your access, and that's certainly something that people are concerned about. I'm going to go with Lisa real fast, and then David.
I would love the slides, Dr. Rice. I'm
Sure.
working with substance use and alcohol use among women after the pandemic, and I'm literally I've done a film, and then I've built something in the film that allows people to interact, and that's what I'm looking at in who's interacting with what and why, and how they engage. And so when I'm sitting here watching this, I'm like, so thank you for the mind blow. But in that sense, what has been the biggest barrier to unlocking the trees for you? Because I know for me, in thinking about how people are going to, I guess, interact with this, because I'm looking at providers that are thinking they know what people want and need, but then the biggest barrier is that the people that need the help don't necessarily want what is being quote unquote provided in medical models. So there's just this complete disconnect.
Yeah. I mean, unlocking the trees is an issue of getting access to the kind of the raw data that you may or may not have access to, and then putting it through the paces of one of these machine learning programs, which may be something that you need a little bit of help from a doc student or someone like that who's got the capacity to do that. But the second point that you made about people not, providers designing interventions that people may or may not want. I mean, I think, even with something like this, the insights, this is coming insights from research, right? So certainly having some communication with people who are in this space around what these insights say and what sorts of interventions they might want, the folks themselves who are suffering, as well as the providers who want to provide relief to that suffering, I think is a really important part of the process. I don't like to assume that as a researcher, I've got all the answers. I usually want to talk to people and ask them what's going on. So sometimes a study like this will end for me with some preliminary insights that then need more vetting with community groups, and sometimes that's informal, right? It's, I'm going to get together, a couple of people and talk to them, or sometimes it's,
there's been many. Yeah. So,
and I think, I would encourage you, it sounds like this is what you're doing already, is you're talking to people, right?
Yeah.
And that's key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, between, treatment centers and then providers and then the women themselves.
Yeah.
So then, it's bringing all the groups together, but then also disseminating the information that I'm getting from the community-based participatory research, and then really listening to the people that have suffered, that have lost people because of the disease, and then bringing the storytelling together, because that's the key thread going through, and looking at the research, and then also looking at, the statistical data of who is dying, who is suffering, who is saying we don't want what is out there, but yet, the bigger problem being insurance and that whole thing. But, I can't help that.
It's all very, very complex, and so I think, and that is another thing that I want to say about this presentation, is that the whole point of doing this social network data mining stuff is because we know that networks are really complicated, and what's important and what's not isn't always obvious. And so can we learn something from using these, newer approaches to data mining to learn something about it, but then also we then still have a lot more work that we need to do even once we've uncovered these insights. It's not, nothing, I mean, unfortunately, this is maybe part of why science is so slow in moving to new answers, is that we always come up with, well, now we're going to equivocate about the next thing. But I also don't want to be so arrogant as to say, oh, I figured this all out. Now, boom, here we go, we're done. So I want to give David a chance to ask his question, and then I realize that we're getting close to the time, and I'll stick around for a little while longer if folks want, but I want to let people also, go on their afternoon if they want.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. This is wonderful, what you're doing and what you're looking at. I really love it, and how you're doing it. You may have covered this. I have a couple of questions and thoughts. Is there a particular theory that you're working from? I know Carl Castro uses the interpersonal theory of suicidal behavior, but was there theory that's behind some of your decisions?
It's interesting. We used theory in a very broad way to identify this universe of potential variables to be looking at. But because this is intentionally an exploratory study that's saying what's going to stick, it is this atheoretical, data mining exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, we have this theory-driven data mining approach, right? So we read, many theories of both social support and social capital, as well as some of the key suicide theories that are out there. And we identified within the data set as many things as we could that we thought would be potentially individual level or network level pieces of information and then saw what shook out at the top. And what shook out at the top was more this interpersonal dynamics. I think because interpersonal dynamic, when the outcome is an interpersonal dynamic, like are you going to disclose suicide to a particular person, other interpersonal dynamics are often the things that drive. There were some individual level characteristics that were in the trees lower down, like your sense that your unit had some cohesiveness was important. There's also some of these models where we've done where there's individual level of depressive symptoms can be important because people are less likely to disclose at all if you are suffering from mental health issues. But those things end up much further down in the structure of the model, and the ones that really rise to the top are things that are closer to the actual issue at hand, which is who are you going to talk to about this really private thing? It's the people that you feel supported by, and you feel supported by around a lot of things. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone for letting me, talk. I will hang out for a few more minutes, but if you need to go, don't hesitate to take off. I will not be offended. And thank you all for your attention. And see you next week when we'll be doing more. Actually, no, next week we're going to do something else. There's Anne Marie's going to be having so 2 weeks from now we'll have the research seminar again. But so thank you all for being. And if there's anyone who wants to stick around and ask another question, she'll be happy. Thanks.